We already have a lot of questions coming in. I will perhaps group them in 3 or 4 and then ask the panel to respond. So the first question we have is, if I can work this thing, is Sohail Al-Rosebi from Bahrain, who is Sohail?
My question is to Bundesverteidigungsminister Dr. Ursula von der Leyen. You said some interesting things. You said about the importance of a coalition for education. You also mentioned respect for human dignity, telling the truth, and these things. I think that's fantastic. You also talked about the vulnerability of youth to Islamic ideology and for them preying on the vulnerable. My concern is, or my question is, regarding the European youth. We see them now being susceptible to extremist ideologies and right-wing ideologies. We see the rise of movements like Pegida and Alternative für Deutschland, UKIP and other extreme groups, or much more extreme groups than UKIP in the UK. What are the European nations, and Germany in particular, doing about this? Because there seems to be a disenfranchised youth within Europe. So perhaps some effort there is necessary. And then a follow-up question from there is, with the rise of these movements, does Mrs. Merkel have a chance to win next year's election? I know she ran again recently. She made some controversial comments about the niqab. So I'd be interested to hear your comments on that as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sohail. The next question is from Dr. Ibtisam Al-Katbi from the UAE.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to address my question in Arabic.
معاليكم أو معاليكي السيدة أرسولا، لقد قلت أننا يجب دائما أن نقول الحقيقة. And from here I will speak honestly and clearly. Honesty implies that the reason behind the appearance of extremism in the region, it's not the lack of job opportunity nor education. There are some who joined ISIS who have very high education, like it was in Qaeda, because many of those who joined Qaeda were doctors and engineers. And the truth says that what is happening in the region, the double standards regarding the Palestinian case or towards Iraq or Syria is the incubator that is producing terrorism. This is why when I asked the American Secretary of Defense about the strategy post-ISIS, meaning how are we going to eliminate these incubators that produce terrorism, and if you are done with ISIS, and I hope, which I think is not going to happen, because terrorism is not individuals but ideas and ideologies, there will be other terrorist groups unless the other problems. Halab is being demolished and the world is standing there watching without any conscience, and this is vacuum is going to produce thousands of terrorists. Also, when Muslims see a German person kicking a woman wearing a veil who didn't do anything but wearing a veil, how is this going to impact thousands who have seen this photo? It is going to create anger, and terrorism has no religion or country or gender. It is not only adhered to this region. As my colleague said, what would make European youth go and join ISIS? It is the loss of hope in the future. Those who need to change the image of Muslims are not only Muslims, but the West also needs to remove this stereotype image about Islam that every Muslim is by necessity a terrorist. This is the honesty that we need, my lady. Thank you.
Different questions in that question. I'll ask Francois Eisberg now to ask a third question. I'm sorry,
It's Wally.
Here we go, thank you. My question is to Ursula von der Leyen and to Jean-Yves Le Drian. We are helping the Kurds who are bravely fighting Daesh. This is something, Madame, that you reminded us of. But what will happen to the Kurds once Daesh's territorial pretensions have been brought to the end, which was promised in fairly short order a few hours ago by our friend Ashton Carter? And the Kurds, as we know, pretty much like Daesh, do have a few problems with the Sykes-Picot system. So what happens next? Merci.
Thank you very much, Francois. We have Kurds in the audience, of course, so we can always ask them what they think about Sykes-Picot. I'll take one more question from Walid Khalid from the Emirates. If we can switch your microphone on. Yeah, good, thank you.
All right, it's on. Thank you. I think Dr. Ibtisam probably said lots of things I wanted to say, so that's good. I'll be straight to the point. I think since the morning we've heard a lot about how successful the coalition have been in beating Daesh or ISIL, and that's great. Mosul, Raqqa, how many miles they've reduced their territories, and how many people from Daesh being killed in their leadership. That's all great. I think the biggest issue is really winning hearts and minds. And I'm glad you've addressed it in some of the speeches we've heard that, about winning hearts and minds. We, as an Arab in this region, are really struggling to raise our families in here, kids, to explain to them what's really going on. I think the values in the West are really great when it comes to fairness, freedom of speech, and so on. And we really appreciate this. But what we see is definitely double standard. An individual does something wrong in Palestine, then the whole community is suffering from that individual, and it's allowed. Aleppo, what's going on in Aleppo in Syria, and Burma. What the media here is probably so much going on in Burma. Some of the scenes are heartbreaking, but we just don't see the West really taking key actions on those. So I agree. We've heard that ISIL is like a tumor or cancer, and cancer do regenerate. So I think if there's a question is, what's key programs on winning hearts and minds rather than just beating Daesh?
Thank you very much. Maybe we should respond.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the last question. I think we learned our lessons from former conflicts and wars. This time in Iraq, so far, many things went in the right direction. I remember 2.5 years ago when Daesh overran Mosul and was almost at the doorstep of Baghdad. We did the right thing, not to think that with foreign military force we can turn things around, but have enough respect and strategic patience to train and equip the local forces, the Peshmerga and the Central Iraqi forces. That was the first thing which was, looking back, the right way to do. Even almost more important was the second thing, which went wrong actually in Iraq 1 and in other places. That we understood that the day we had taken back territorial cities from Daesh, the day after the military victory, immediately has to come in reconstruction, reconciliation, electricity, water, fix the houses, IEDs have to be cleared and stuff like that, because people have to see immediately that it makes a difference whether Daesh is ruling them or whether they have been freed. And then, of course, this is the immediate daily life. And the reconciliation is extremely important, because in that region have lived people together of different religious or ethnic backgrounds. Because of Daesh, a lot of wounds have been opened. So the most difficult part is, after having freed the cities, not to have revenge and hatred ruling, but reconciliation. And for that, and this is the largest and most important thing, you have to fight poverty. You have to bring jobs in the region, which is easily said and hard to do, which is the whole topic of reconstruction. You have to respect that political participation is necessary for every single group. This was the beginning. At the beginning of the conflict, it was easy for Daesh to win hearts and minds because there was not a political inclusion for all groups. Therefore, many steps have been done in the right direction, but we are not at the end, certainly not. And therefore, I may come to the second question concerning the Kurds, although the colleague, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, is sitting here in the room. What will happen next to the Kurds afterwards? I think we know and we admire the courage with which the Kurds and the Peshmerga have fought for their homeland, but still we think the overall future for Iraq would be a better one if Iraq stays together, and if there are discussions about forms of decentralization that might work for every group. It has to be fair. The most difficult part is if after, or the largest threat is after having defeated Daesh, if Sunni, Shia, Kurds, and others fight in between their groups. There was a nice question whether Angela Merkel will be running again for Chancellor. Yes, she will. And we're going to campaign hard and intensively to win these elections. The future will show. Yes, you have been asking about Pegida, AfD, UKIP, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Le Front National, Marine Le Pen in France, and in other regions. We think, first of all, this is a reaction to what you feel too in your regions, to globalization. Globalization means not only prosperity, but it also means social division in some areas. Some get more and more wealthy and others get more and more poor, and the middle class is shrinking. A second point is important, that conflicts and crises are being globalized to problems. We made the experience in the last year with the refugee crisis in Europe that we cannot think that this region here is far away. No, it's just our neighborhood. And digitalization brings in the speed of communication around the world. And for some, this is scary. For some, this is scary, and some want to hear simple answers to these very complex questions. The simple answer is, which is the wrong answer in my eyes, let's pull back to the nationalistic attitude. Let's close up. It's often accompanied by Islamophobia, as I said. It's accompanied by racism. It seems to be the simple answer, but it certainly is not the answer where, with partnership, we can work for a better future in a globalized world. And globalization and digitalization will not stop. The problems will keep on going, even if some pretend to pull back on the national basis. Within these problems and within these new right-wing populist movements, there's also the chance for those who stand up for open societies. It's a chance for those who have to speak up again and find a convincing language for democracies, for participation, political participations of all groups that live in a country, for the freedom of opinion, for the freedom of speech, for the freedom of religion that is independent to whomever or in what kind of God or religion you believe in, or whether you change your religion, or whether you have no religion. As long as you are not hurting others, you have the freedom to speak up and to behave. And I think by now, and this is where we find our close cooperation between Europe and this region here, those who want to shape change that is happening, taking place, change is taking place. Those who want to shape the change peacefully, with respect for different opinions, should stand together against those who want to prevent change by aggression, by exclusion, and by radicalization.
Je suis d'accord avec
I fully subscribe to everything Ursula has just told us, but let me simply answer the question that was directly posed to me by Françoise Bourg, and perhaps make a comment on the a question asked by the representative of the Emirates on the Kurds. I have had a chance to talk with President Barzani on several occasions, even before the coalition started its engagement to retake Mosul. What strikes me and has always struck me about Iraq is, first of all, the importance of the dialogue that took place in the preparatory phase between the Kurdish authorities and the Baghdad authorities. It wasn't easy. I remember the days where, in fact, it was very complicated, but they did find an agreement. And in fact, it is a twofold agreement, or that's how I would describe it. It is first a political agreement about how you manage the day after Mosul, if you will, and how do you respect the various communities in the post-Mosul era. And then it's also a military agreement on who does what when and who takes what when. And where do all the various parties and to the engagement settle after the engagement, after the fight? And my feeling, and I think I'm right, my feeling is that all of these points have been respected, and I think it is a great show of political strength of all parties that they could both fight that fight and anticipate on the future. Which is why earlier on I talked about the inclusiveness shown by the Prime Minister. Think of it. Not everyone in the history of Iraq has had that same attitude, but I think in this specific instance we have seen a great degree of understanding. I wouldn't dare, however, try and predict what will happen on the day after in Syria. In fact, if you have any ideas to share, feel free to do so. And I'm thinking, including of the Kurds who have led important fights against Daesh in Syria, because this is still going on. It has been going on. It's still going on. Then there will have to be a political process that respects all of that. Maybe it will be more complex to implement that the one which I hope will happen in Iraq. Regarding observations made in particular by the representative of the Emirates, which strikes me when you look at who these Frenchmen are who are leaving France to fight in Daesh ranks, those who left France to go and fight there, and there are about 800 of them. And in fact, over 200 of them have already been killed in combat. And when you look at the kind of lives that they'd had, it certainly is a mixed bag. It's a complex picture, and so I will subscribe to what you said in that those are not young people who are poor. In many cases, those are even young people who have received training, academic training or intellectual training, and who could have had a safe professional future in France. And so young people who were not excluded from society. And so you cannot for a second believe that it is, this picture of those, poor, destitute, marginalized young people. No. But they were looking for a destiny, and maybe they were susceptible to an ideology that triggered something in them that had been there for a long time, maybe a rejection of the society they live in, maybe not for economic reasons, but for maybe more fundamental ideology-tied reasons. But that certainly, and I think Ursula was saying that minutes ago, it certainly means that we need to bring together a coalition of forces to fight indoctrination, because all religions around the world have always had their radicals and had their fanatics, and still do. So it is not the monopoly of one religion. And in order to fight the long-term fight against terrorism, I think that it will be necessary to start the type of discussions, perhaps, in fact, in the framework of the Manama dialogue or similar fora, to make sure that all people can freely express their religion without fighting against others. Because as I said earlier on, I have been very impressed by the exchanges that took place at the Dakar Forum this past weekend, where you had major actors of the political and religious communities of those African countries all saying we should get together to diffuse the message of peace of the religion we believe in. And I think that is the real fight that we should start fighting over and beyond military aspects.
Chairman, I thought I'd add to the discussion, especially with regard to what all of us have agreed, that this is ultimately an ideological battle. And I want to keep my remarks brief, but I thought it would be instructive to share the Singapore experience. And let me upfront say the caveats that from Singapore's point of view, we don't purport to want to teach anybody, but we're just sharing our approach to the problem. And as some of you who are aware of our country's history, we're a multiracial population, 70% predominantly Chinese, 15% Muslims, and the rest of the 15% of Indians, as well as other races. So from independence, we've had to deal with this issue. How do you integrate people of different faiths? And the steps that we took, I would say, don't conform to sometimes the ideals of Western democracies. And if I could summarize it, the assumptions, I think, that our founding leaders, and some of you have met Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was probably twofold. The first assumption was that left on its own, people gravitate towards their own ethnic groups. And that worked against integration. The second assumption was that you need to give people stake in the progress of the society for them to buy into whatever ideology or whatever political system there is. Let me just describe 3 areas in which this ideology was translated into physical policy. One is our legal systems. So we realized that race and religion were sensitive, and that we have laws in which you inflame race sentiments based on race. You can be detained, you can be penalized. And we've had cases where even youngsters used the internet and spoke against religious leaders, and we basically picked them up, counseled them, and then asked them to stop it. That's just one example. The second example is our social systems. We realized that if you left people to make decisions on their own, and very natural for us to gravitate. The Chinese would go with Chinese, live with them, go to the same schools, the Indians and the Malays. So we have quotas in place. We have quotas in place not so much to, just for the specific reason that we want to promote social mixing. You could say that you would leave to the population to make these decisions because they're adults. So for our housing policies, if a particular estate, the quota rises and there are too many Chinese, we just say, well, you can't sell to Chinese anymore. And it's hardwired into the system. And as a result of that, you have greater social mixing in schools. That's another example. We have self-help groups, which are race-based. In other words, we have Malay self-help groups, Indian self-help groups, Chinese self-help groups. There have been alternate arguments to say that you really ought to evolve and they should be race-blind. We've never believed in that, and we believe that Malays understand their Muslim problems more, Indians understand their Indian problems more, and Chinese understand their Chinese problems more. I'm quite aware that when I share these examples, it may go against some Western sensitivity. So please remember my caveat, we are not about to teach anybody. We have it hardwired in our political systems. In other words, when you stand for elections, our rules are that you must bring in together other races. You can't stand as an all-Chinese political group. You must bring in Malays, you must bring in Indians. Again, that's hardwired. We recently had a constitutional amendment because we have an elected presidency. It's a 6-year term. And we started this perhaps about 30 years ago. And we told our people that if left alone to natural inclinations, that it would be harder for minority races to be elected as president. We told them up front. We basically said that we all have our racial tendencies and that it was a mistake. And therefore, we moved an amendment to ensure that if after X number of years, if a minority race is not elected a president, the next election is reserved only for minorities. Final example to show how sensitive we are. When we launch a platform in my Singapore Armed Forces, we have 9 of our official leaders of our officially recognized religions to bless the ship or the plane. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. If I'm allowed to, I'd just like to say a word myself about Burma, because this was mentioned. And I'm not Burmese, of course, but I was British ambassador there for 4 years, and Daw Aung San Suu Kyi is a friend of mine. And I talked to her about the issue of the Rohingya, which, of course, is a particularly sensitive issue in this part of the world. You have to remember what sort of state Burma is. In 1950, the Rangoon government controlled a radius of about 12 miles around Rangoon. There had been ethnic conflicts for the last 65 years in Burma. There are about 135 registered ethnicities in Burma, of whom the Rohingya are one. There are continuing ethnic conflicts in Rakhine State, in northern Kachin state, in northern Shan state, and down parts of the border with Thailand. This is the first democratically elected government in Burma since 1962. They are facing huge challenges. The political situation remains fragile, and everybody in Burma thinks they have been oppressed over the last 65 years. They are struggling with this, and they need help. It is going to take time to resolve this issue. I know it is a highly sensitive issue, but they need time and space. I will just say that on behalf of Dorsu.
Can I just make a comment on the Rohingyas? As a good example of how our approach to these problems is to facilitate. We did not want the Rohingya situation to precipitate, as a member of the audience rightly pointed out. Why aren't non-Muslims doing enough? Or why is it left only to the Muslim communities? And so we encourage volunteer groups, VWOs, to take the lead, whether it was the Red Cross, whether it was church groups, as a humanitarian crisis. That's our approach. We recognize that if you allow race to polarize, there will be rhetoric, there will be fiery arguments, but sometimes less gets done. And we take a very practical approach that ultimately tells our people that there are constraints, race and religion are very real and will never go away, and that rather than take a completely ideological approach, a practical approach sometimes works better.
Yes. Okay. I'll now take another set of questions. I think I will, since we've talked about Iraq quite a lot, I think it's time to give people from Iraq a chance to ask questions or comment. And I'm going to start in the north, from the Kurdish regional government down, swinging perhaps from Erbil through Sulaymaniyah down to Baghdad. So if I might invite my old friend Falah Mustafa Bakir to take the floor, either to comment or to ask a question. Falah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I would like to start by thanking Germany, France, and the rest of the US-led coalition in supporting us in our fight against ISIS. Going back to the history of Kurds in Iraq, we have suffered a lot and we have had a difficult past. But in 1991, where the Kurdish Spring started, during the uprising, we were able to introduce a new experience. From 1991 until 2003, we were able to run the region without the control of Saddam Hussein regime. In fact, it was in October 1992 when the leadership in Kurdistan region and the people of Kurdistan, through their elected parliament, adopted a federal solution to build, to define the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad based on federalism. Although we were not under the control of Saddam Hussein regime, but still we believe that we can be better off with having a federal system in the country. That continued until 2003. In 2003, we were almost independent. We decided voluntarily to go back to Baghdad. The leadership in Kurdistan went to Baghdad to rebuild a better Iraq, i.e. a federal, democratic, pluralistic Iraq. But unfortunately, it did not work because we did not see the partnership that we have been aspiring to. None of the problems that we had with Baghdad were solved and addressed. All these problems are still called the pending issues between Erbil and Baghdad. True, today there is military cooperation between Erbil and Baghdad. There is a good relationship between President Barzani and Prime Minister Abadi, but this is only talking about the military aspect. We need to have a political dialogue as well. During the visits of Prime Minister Barzani end of August and President Barzani end of September, that issue was raised that we need to have a dialogue between Erbil and Baghdad to determine the future relationship between Kurdistan and the rest of Iraq, or Erbil and Baghdad. And we hope that after Mosul operation, we will be able to address this issue because the right to self-determination is a given right based on the UN Charter. Kurdistan, the people of Kurdistan have shown and demonstrated that in the informal referendum that took place in 2005 when 97% of the people voted for independence. But the leadership at the time managed the expectation of the people to be part of a federal democratic Iraq. But unfortunately, we did not feel that we were partners. We were not partners in decision-making. In February 2014, we have seen a collective punishment of the people of the region when the then Prime Minister Maliki cut off the budget of the region unlawfully and unconstitutionally. So even looking at today, the bulk of the fight against ISIS is on the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. The front line is 1,050 kilometers long. We have given more than 1,600 Peshmergas and martyrs, over 9,000 as wounded. We are also home to nearly 2 million internally displaced people from the rest of Iraq and refugees from Syria, yet the government in Baghdad has not fulfilled its responsibilities towards us. Therefore, we want to engage in a serious and meaningful dialogue with Baghdad on the future of Kurdistan, including independence. But we want to achieve that through peaceful means and dialogue and not through violence. And thank you.
I will now give the floor to Dr. Hachim Al-Hassani from Iraq. Let me put you on the...
Thank you, John. I'll speak in Arabic.
His Excellency, the Secretary of Defense from France spoke about the inclusive war against terrorism and what it's required as a war. But what you notice in Iraq right now, the interest in the military side is dominating other aspects or other fields. Now there is like millions of displaced people from the cities and from the western provinces, and also many of the totally destroyed cities, and poverty and the lack of job opportunities or the absence of job opportunities. All of that is providing an incubator for the terrorism, providing an environment for recruitment by the different terrorism organizations. We don't see a good interest actually and frankly in the other fields. Before starting the Battle of Mosul, we were talking and saying that we need to have a good interest in the political, economic context and to be in parallel working together, so not to be surprised after the end of Mosul battle with other consequences. But unfortunately, all the programs are concentrating on the military side and they left the other, let's say, fields. Talking about strategies, talking about the Iranian dominations and powers for sure and influence. Iran have a strategy in Iraq, but not even the region or the other countries have a strategy in Iraq in eliminating or limiting this Iranian influence in Iraq. It was indicated by His Excellency the Secretary of Defense from France about the agreement that were signed between the central government and the Kurdish brothers regarding the Mosul city. The Mosul city, or the province of Mosul, is a Sunni Arabic province. We have different components from the Kurdish, from the Yazidis, from the Christians, and from other ethnic groups. We can't have an agreement between our brothers from the Kurdish and also the central government with the absence of the people of the area and the province. And we said that the people of this region, they are the main key players in fighting terrorism. So if you can't even absorb the people of this region, you can't eliminate the terrorism. So I find this is odd, strange, to have an agreement in this meaning, a political agreement, or other than that, without having the other component in this, let's say, like in this equation. So we don't have even in Iraq or in Syria an integrated or an inclusive war against terrorism, but it's a war focusing on the military side. And thank you very much.
I have 3 more questions I'd like to get through in this session. Can I invite Iseok Kwon from South Korea to ask?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to the presentation by Minister Ursula von der Leyen, I would appreciate the German contribution in combating terrorism, extremism, radicalism in the Middle East in various military means, as you described earlier. Also, the same appreciation goes to the Singaporean and French defense ministers for their contribution in our fight against the extremism. And the Minister of Germany discussed the fundamental principles to comply with in our fight against terrorism and radicalism. You include telling the truth and also narratives, convincing narratives based on the local source, also balance of control and freedom of domain. Yet I think we are missing here one very critical element in our fight against terrorism and radicalism, which is education. Someone yesterday at the Sky News interview mentioned our fight against radicalism is a generational fight. So we should take our fight against radicalism from the long-term perspective. Then I think to introduce our concepts, views in the school textbooks will be very useful to teach young kids from early on. And also arranging for students to conduct the practice against the radicalism and terrorism in daily life. So I'd like to emphasize the importance of education as one of the critical and fundamental principles in our fight against terrorism. And with regard to the presentation by Minister Ng Eng Hen of Singapore, and I fully share the concerns expressed by the minister over the spread of extremism and actual terrorist incidents happening in Southeast Asia. And we living in Northeast Asia are also very much concerned about the potential proliferation of these terrorist accidents and also the ideological proliferation in our parts. And we have the chance to further, we need, in that sense, more collaboration between Southeast Asia, which has been suffering from this radicalism and terrorist incidents, and the Middle East, where we see the daily episodes and incidents emanating from the radicalism and terrorist ideologies. So perhaps as you discussed, some intelligence collaboration or even joint operation between the two security-related organizations of Southeast Asia and the Middle East can be worthwhile to be further explored. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. Can I ask my colleague Dana Allen to ask a question?
Thanks, John. My question to the German and French defense ministers. Minister von der Leyen, you said in regard to recent Western elections that populism is rising, and so is Islamophobia. And Minister Drian said something on the order of, at least as it was translated, no matter how dangerous the threat, we must still comply with international law. And both of those statements lead me to a simple question. Can countries like Germany and France really stand strong against intolerance, Islamophobia, and even war crimes if an important country like the United States, under the new leadership of President Trump, does not?
Thanks, Dana. And now the last word in this round, as I think the first word in the first round, to Sohail Al-Rasebi.
That's a strong question.
Is your microphone on?
Is it on? Yes.
Yeah.
My question is to the minister from Singapore. I was very intrigued by what you were saying about the protection of minority rights and minority groups and so on. But and you also gave the caveat of saying this might offend some Western sensibilities. I'm just curious, how does one start a political party and then bring in other minorities? Do you have to, is there a classification system in Singapore and based on race? And then isn't that extremely controversial? Does someone have to self-identify? Can someone say, I don't want to be Chinese anymore, I want to be Malay, or I want to be Indian. So I'm just curious about the mechanics of how that works.
Thanks, Suhail. Right, I think I shall ask the panel to respond. I think it's probably the last round of responses.
I want to answer to the questions in a whole, and the lady from the UAE, I have to apologize, I didn't answer to your stereotype topic, but it's included in that. Yes, you're right, we have a lot of stereotypes in our heads. There are a lot of stereotypes about men and women in our heads. There are a lot of stereotypes about ethnic background in our heads, and there are many, many stereotypes about religion. And when I listened to you, as far as I understood the translation, you described what Christians do to Muslims. I remember in the context where I live, how many stereotypes, prejudices, and false informations are there, what Muslims do to Christians or others. So what we have to work for is that we have to dismantle these stereotypes, and we can only do that, and that was my plea in my short notes at the very beginning, that we should not leave the field neither to the extremists like Daesh, nor to the right-wing populists to define what religion is and who, presumably, the enemy is. We should not leave them the field so that they are cementing the stereotypes, the false information, and the fake news about the competition between religions. But we have to explain what are secular societies, what are laïcistic societies, what are Christian societies, Shia, Sunni, Islam, and many, many others. I have not even spoken about the Asian context now. So what the important part is we have to speak up and tell our own story, put our own narrative out there, and make sure this is the majority. It's perhaps a silent majority, but we are the majority who want a peaceful living together of different religions and tolerance towards different religions. And this comes to the Korean question. You might have noticed that my first point was education. Education gives you differentiation and the ability to argue and the ability to make up your mind by your own. So, of course, what I said at the very beginning, if we want to be successful over time, we do not only need a coalition against terror on a military foundation, but we need a coalition for education, including all the topics we are just discussing now. And we see within that room how many prejudices are out there and stereotypes are out there. We really can and should dismantle. And therefore, at the very end, we are very different from each other, no question at all. The Asian, the Arab area, let me call it the transatlantic area, but we share a common interest. We share a common interest that we do not want to leave this world to extremists or to populists, but we want to shape this world in a peaceful, informed, and objective way. And therefore, we have to make sure that we are much more dominant, mainly in the social media, to tell our story, our narrative, and not let them hijack our religion or our way to live.
Pour dire deux mots à Monsieur Den Halen concernant...
Just two words to Mr. Den Halen about the principles of law and the principles of democracy and the principles of respect for others and tolerance and the fight against Islamophobia, which you rattled off in your question. Well, those are principles that are intangible to us. So whatever the position you take, they remain essential. They're intangible for France in light of our history, for France and Germany, because we're part of the EU. And those are fundamental principles that underpin the European construction. And as for the U.S., I am in no position to make comments on what the president-elect is going to say or do. He should be inaugurated as president first. I'm reading so many different things in the newspapers. But as for those principles, yes, they're here and they will remain there. They're there to stay. As for the question posed by Mr. Al-Hassani, which I listened to attentively, he voiced his beliefs forcefully, and I do share the two major points that he raised. One, the fact that the answer to the crisis in Iraq cannot be merely military. If you don't have an immediate element of support for the economy and for society, you will see the same mistakes of the past being repeated. And so the effort, the international effort, should start happening much faster than it is right now, including on the humanitarian front. I'm very concerned by that. I don't know where he is in the room, but I think he is very concerned by that too. I mean, by the situation in Mosul over the coming days and weeks, and the fact that it will soon be winter, and will populations be able to exit the city? Will we have the ability to give them shelter in the interim refugee camps, and then you'll have to feed them and help them? And so I think the reconstruction effort in Iraq is going to be the main challenge in the coming weeks, and I think that our response should be quicker than it currently is. On the next question about managing the future of the Nineveh governorate, well, first and foremost, it is the responsibility of the Iraqis themselves. In fact, I didn't take that question by Mr. Al-Hassani to be directed at me, but certainly I am convinced that as part of the way that the Nineveh governor is managed going forward, I'm convinced that the Yazidis, the Christians, all the communities that you mentioned, the Kurds, the Sunni Arabs, the Shia Arabs, I mean, all the communities are present there. The exact proportion depends on the territory, but certainly that should be reflected in the makeup of the future government there. And I feel that it's a point of view that's actually shared by the people I talk to, whether it's the Kurdish government or Mr. Abadi. But, you know, of course, it will be up to the Iraqis to then implement that. As for the rest, I subscribe to what Ursula had just said about education and refusing intolerance in all its guises.
Of what we've been talking about, dismantling the stereotypes and to put out our own narrative. Yesterday I've been in Riyadh, and very practical. We agreed that we're going to establish a working group just to learn more from each other, to find the stereotypes and the false narratives and the lies in the internet, and to put against it our own story. And I think it would be great if we could enlarge this very practical work, if there's interest in the room. And IISS would be a wonderful platform to use that, just to learn more from each other and put out our common narrative as we pointed it out in this session here.
Thank you very much. A fantastic idea. We should take it forward.
Let me thank the gentleman for that question. It's a very perceptive one. He wanted to know what the processes, whether they were controversial. And indeed, actually, the processes are non-controversial, and there's a reason for it. When the government of that day persuaded the people, there was an evolution. They had seen what started out as race-based parties. In other words, Chinese-based parties, Malay-based parties, and Indian-based parties. And obviously, the obvious happen, where each race-based party would champion its political platform to persuade its own population, whether it's Chinese, Malays, or Indians, or other races. So the political challenge was, how do you ensure that any political party campaigns for all races, not only its own race? And the solution was, as we saw it, in other words, you put constituencies together, 3, 4, 5, and in any of that group, you must have at least one minority race. The question was, how do you do it practically? It's not difficult. It's a community test. You gather a group of community-wise men who will certify that you're Chinese, Malay, or Indian, and based on whether the community accepts you. So it's been non-controversial, and it seems to have worked well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. We have come to the end of the session. I think the two conclusions I would draw, general conclusions, are A, that this is an extraordinarily rich, complicated, and global issue. We do not have the answers, but we are seeking for them. And I think, as Minister von der Leyen said at the beginning, the important thing is for us to speak truth to each other. I think we have tried in this session, I think, to do that. I think we need to do more of it. I think it is important because without acknowledging honestly where we are, what the situation is, what our problems are, and what potential solutions are, and the fact that there are different models for this, I think we will find it difficult to get anywhere. To show that we don't just do things like combating extremism, though we would be very interested in pursuing this idea that the Minister raised about encouraging a more coordinated approach to untruth, which is out there. Outside, I would just like to draw your attention before we break for lunch to the fantastic display we have of the military balance, which is out there in various forms, in written, in video, in cyber, all sorts of digital forms, which I commend to you if you're interested in knowing the current state of play of the world's armed forces. So can I ask everybody to join me in thanking the panel, the very distinguished panel, for this fantastic and rich discussion. And we now break for lunch, and I think we resume at 3:30 in the same room. Thank you very much.